When 6 merchants disappeared from a sealed chamber, November 17th, 1847. The sealed envelope arrived on Savannah's doorsteps like an unwanted prophecy. 6 men of considerable fortune would gather in a windowless chamber, lock themselves inside, and by midnight would cease to exist in any form the living could comprehend. What remained was a room frozen in time, brandy glasses catching lamplight, pipes smoldering with tobacco still warm, and carved deep into rosewood paneling 3 words that would haunt investigators for decades: accounts come due. This is not a story about where they went. This is a story about what they had done, and why the night of November 17th, 1847 demanded they answer for it. November 3rd, 1847. 6 identical cards delivered by courier before sunrise, each sealed with black wax pressed with an unfamiliar mark, a broken compass rose overlaid with cotton bolls. The paper itself was expensive, imported stock that only Charleston or Savannah's finest stationers would carry, yet no stationer claimed to have printed them. The message was identical on each card, printed in Gothic typeface that suggested formality and finality. A settlement of mutual concern demands immediate conference. November 17th, 7 o'clock evening. The Magnolia Society, Parlor 7. Your presence is required, not requested. This invitation must be destroyed immediately. No signature, no explanation, no sender identification. Edmund Whitmore received his at breakfast. At 58, he controlled 3 shipping companies and held interests in 4 cotton warehouses. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the card over, searching for clues in the paper grain, the ink composition, anything that might reveal its origin. He did not destroy it. Daniel Prescott, 42, and ruthlessly ambitious, discovered his invitation when his valet brought morning correspondence. Prescott had built his wealth through calculated risk. Cotton speculation that had bankrupted lesser men had made him rich. The anonymity of the invitation bothered him more than its cryptic content. In Savannah's interconnected society, anonymity was nearly impossible. Someone was deliberately concealing their identity. Robert Blackwell, at 51, prided himself on methodical thinking. He maintained detailed ledgers of every transaction, every contract, every agreement. The invitation represented a problem he couldn't categorize. The broken compass seal was unfamiliar. He knew every significant merchant seal and family crest in Georgia. This was something new, or something deliberately obscured. Henry Caldwell, 47, came from old Savannah money, 3 generations of accumulated wealth and social standing. He was known for discretion, for handling delicate matters that other men preferred to avoid. The invitation filled him with a dread he couldn't articulate, as if something long buried was clawing its way to the surface. Samuel Dutton, at 39, was still establishing his reputation. His single cotton brokerage had grown impressively in 5 years, but he remained anxious about maintaining his position among Savannah's elite. The invitation's formal tone and ominous wording triggered a cascade of worry he struggled to suppress. The youngest recipient was Jonathan Merrick, 36, who had inherited his father's trading business 3 years prior. He still felt like an imposter among established merchants, always worried his inexperience would betray him. The invitation made his stomach tighten with an anxiety that had no clear source. None of them destroyed their invitations. Over the following 14 days, each man conducted private investigations. They made subtle inquiries through social channels. They examined paper suppliers and print shops. Prescott even hired a private investigator to identify the seal's origin. The man found nothing. The Magnolia Society occupied a dignified building on Bull Street, where Savannah's wealthy gathered for business discussions disguised as social occasions. Parlor 7 was on the 3rd floor, a small, secure room with a single door and no windows. Its walls were paneled in dark rosewood, and it could be locked from within. The room was designed for confidential negotiations, where secrets could be spoken without fear of exposure. As November 17th approached, the 6 men exhibited increasingly disturbed behavior. Their families would later provide testimony that painted a portrait of mounting terror. Edmund Whitmore's wife noticed he had begun sleeping with a loaded pistol beside his bed. He'd installed additional locks on their bedroom door. Some nights she woke to find him standing at the window, staring into darkness as if expecting to see someone approaching through their garden. When she asked what troubled him, he claimed business concerns kept him awake, but she had been married to him for 30 years and knew the difference between business worry and genuine fear. Daniel Prescott spent the afternoon of November 16th burning documents in his study. His clerk witnessed this unusual behavior, but said nothing. Prescott had never destroyed records before. He believed in documentation, in paper trails that could prove his version of events. Yet here he was, feeding page after page into the fireplace flames. Robert Blackwell's wife found him in his study on November 15th, writing letters. He sealed them individually and gave her strange instructions. If anything happened to him, she was to burn these letters unread. She protested why write letters meant to be destroyed. He wouldn't explain, only repeated his instructions with an intensity that frightened her. Henry Caldwell visited St. John's Cathedral on November 16th. The priest later recalled that Caldwell seemed desperate to confess something, but couldn't find the words. He sat in a pew for hours, hands clasped, lips moving in silent prayer that looked more like pleading than worship. Samuel Dutton hired night guards for his property in mid-November. His business manager thought this excessive. There had been no threats, no incidents that warranted such security, but Dutton insisted, and the guards reported strange occurrences, figures moving at the property boundaries who vanished when approached, sounds like voices chanting in languages none of them recognized. Jonathan Merrick wrote a letter to his sister in the morning of November 17th. He sealed it with instructions that it should only be opened if he failed to return home. The letter would later vanish before anyone could read it, but his sister remembered her brother's face that morning, pale, drawn, like a man walking towards his own execution. The day dawned cold and overcast. By afternoon, a peculiar fog had rolled in from the Savannah River, thick, persistent, the kind of fog that muffled sound and reduced the world to gray shadows. Local fishermen later said the fog felt wrong, unnatural for the season, as if the weather itself was responding to some approaching event. By evening, visibility had reduced to a few yards. Street lamps created isolated pools of weak light that barely penetrated the murk. Carriages moved slowly, drivers navigating more by instinct than sight. The Magnolia Society's doorkeeper, Isaac Beale, maintained meticulous records. His logbook would become crucial evidence. Edmund Whitmore arrived first at 6:48 p.m. Beale noted that Whitmore seemed agitated, kept glancing back towards the street as if followed. Daniel Prescott entered at 6:59 p.m., entering without his usual confidence. Robert Blackwell came at 6:56 p.m., carrying a leather case he refused to surrender to coat check. Henry Caldwell arrived at 6:59 p.m., asking Beale if anything unusual had occurred that evening. Samuel Dutton entered at 7:02 p.m., pale and sweating despite the cold. Jonathan Merrick was last, arriving at exactly 7:06 p.m., apologizing for his lateness, though he was barely late at all. 6 men proceeded to the 3rd floor. Parlor 7's door was solid oak with a brass lock mechanism that could only be engaged from inside. At 7:09 p.m., Isaac Beale heard the distinctive click of the lock sliding home. The men had sealed themselves inside. The Magnolia Society had 12 other members present that evening. Several reported hearing voices from Parlour 7 around 7:30 p.m., not loud enough to discern words, but the cadence suggested serious, heated discussion. The building manager, Thomas Finch, passed the room at approximately 7:45 p.m. and confirmed hearing multiple voices engaged in what sounded like an argument. At 8:33 p.m., the voices stopped. Several members remarked on this later, not that the voices grew quiet, but that they stopped abruptly, mid-conversation. One member, Judge Nathaniel Brooks, was reading in the library and noted that the sudden silence was so absolute that he could hear his pocket watch ticking. At 10:15 p.m., Isaac Beale became concerned. Nearly 3 hours had passed since the men locked themselves inside. He climbed to the 3rd floor and knocked. No response. He knocked harder, called out. Still nothing. He could see lamplight beneath the door, but heard no movement, no voices, nothing. Bell fetched Thomas Finch, who brought additional staff. They knocked repeatedly. They called the men's names. The door remained locked from inside, light visible beneath it, but absolute silence from within. At 10:47 p.m., Finch sent for a locksmith. Marcus Hewitt arrived at 11:19 p.m. with his tools. The lock was properly engaged from inside. Hewitt could tell someone had deliberately turned the mechanism. He worked carefully, aware he was dealing with society property. By 11:43 p.m., he had the lock open. Thomas Finch pushed the door open. The room was empty. 6 lamps still burned, wicks trimmed, fuel sufficient for hours more. 6 chairs pushed back from the table as if their occupants had stood suddenly. 6 glasses of brandy sat barely touched. 6 pipes rested in porcelain dishes. 5 burned down to ash, but Edmund Whitmore's was still smoking, a thin ribbon of gray rising toward the ceiling, as if he had just set it down. The room had no windows. The walls were solid rosewood paneling, no hidden passages, no secret doors. The floor was hardwood, no loose boards, no concealed openings. The ceiling was plaster, unbroken and intact. 6 men had entered. The door had locked from inside. Now they were gone. But they had left something. Carved into the rosewood table, fresh cuts showing pale wood beneath the dark finish, with 3 words: "Accounts come due." Below the words were numbers, scratched over so violently they were illegible. Surrounding the numbers were tally marks, hundreds of them, covering nearly 3 feet of table surface. Later, investigators would count them, exactly 183 marks. Personal belongings remained. Whitmore's gold pocket watch still ticking, Prescott's leather notebook on his chair, Blackwell's case closed on the table, Caldwell's walking stick against the wall, Dutton's hat on the coat hook, Merrick's gloves on the armrest. Isaac Bell, standing in the doorway, would later tell investigators the room felt wrong. Not cold, not dark, but fundamentally wrong in a way he couldn't articulate, like a space where something terrible had occurred, except nothing was disturbed. Everything was exactly where it should be, except for 6 men who should have been sitting at that table. Thomas Finch sent for authorities immediately. By 12:45 a.m. on November 18th, Sheriff William Porter arrived with 6 deputies. Porter was methodical, experienced in Savannah's various crimes. He had never encountered anything like this. The room measured 18 feet by 22 feet. No hidden passages, no loose panels. The walls were solid. Inspectors confirmed this by tapping every inch. The door had been locked from inside with the key still in the mechanism. No other exits existed. The smoking pipe bothered Porter. Whitmore's pipe had been actively smoldering when they opened the door. That meant it had been used within the past 10 to 15 minutes. Yet the men had been inside for over 3 hours, and the last voices had been heard nearly 2 hours ago. The brandy was tested. Nothing unusual, no trace of poison or sedatives. The carved words and tally marks were documented.
A woodworking expert confirmed the marks were fresh, made within the past few hours, gouged with substantial force. Porter interviewed everyone present: 12 society members, 4 staff members including Bell and Finch. The locksmith confirmed no one could have left the room while it remained locked from inside. No one had seen the 6 men leave. No one had heard anything unusual after 8:33 p.m. when the voices stopped. The investigation expanded. Deputies were dispatched to each missing man's residence. What they discovered deepened the mystery rather than solving it. What they found at the homes. At Edmund Whitmore's house, deputies found his study in disarray, books scattered, papers strewn across his desk. His wife Margaret was adamant that the room had been orderly when she'd last seen it that afternoon. Whitmore was fastidious about his workspace. The disorder was inexplicable. In the study's fireplace, partially burned letters, dozens of them. Deputies carefully extracted fragments. Most were too damaged to read, but one legible sentence survived. "They are keeping records of the April transaction. We are all implicated." Margaret Whitmore had never seen these letters. She knew nothing of any April transaction. She mentioned her husband's recent behavior, the insomnia, the paranoia, the way he'd stand at their bedroom window for hours, watching the street below as if someone would emerge from the darkness. At Daniel Prescott's home, deputies found a locked drawer in his desk had been forced open from the inside. The wood was splintered, the lock mechanism broken outward. The drawer was empty. Prescott's wife insisted only her husband had the key, and she'd never known him to damage his own furniture. Under their mattress, a loaded pistol and a hand-drawn map showing Savannah's waterways with dates marked at specific locations: April 7th, April 19th, June 28th, September 3rd. Robert Blackwell's wife directed deputies to her husband's study, where his business journals, 42 leather-bound volumes spanning 15 years, were arranged chronologically on mahogany shelves. One was missing: April to October 1847. Her husband had seen him writing in it just last week. Blackwell was obsessive about his records. He would never remove a volume from that room. Tucked into an 1846 journal, deputies found a loose page in Blackwell's handwriting, a list of names, 63 names total, all appearing to be names of enslaved people, though not from Blackwell's own properties. Next to each name, either transferred or lost. The date at the top, April 21, 1847. At Henry Caldwell's residence, deputies found his private journal open on his desk. The final entry was dated November 16th, the day before his disappearance. "I can no longer remain silent about what we have done. Tomorrow we meet to discuss resolution. I intend to inform them that I will approach the authorities regardless of the consequences. What happened in April demands accountability. Some debts must be paid, no matter the cost to our reputations or fortunes. God help us all." Earlier entries referenced the agreement, the arrangement, and what happened in April. Caldwell wrote of guilt, of sleepless nights, of seeing faces that haunted him. Samuel Dutton's household was most disturbing. His servants reported their master had become increasingly paranoid over recent weeks. He hired extra guards. He'd begun locking himself in his bedroom each night. In Dutton's bedroom, deputies found scratch marks on the inside of his door, deep gouges as if someone had clawed desperately at the wood. The door opened normally, wasn't stuck or locked. Why would someone claw at a functioning door? On his bedside, a Bible opened to Psalms. Verse 37:13 was underlined so violently the pen had torn the page. "But the Lord laughs at the wicked, for he knows their day is coming." Jonathan Merrick's sealed letter to his sister had vanished. No one could locate it. In his study, deputies found extensive correspondence with shipping companies, all dated from late October through November 1st. Merrick had been attempting to book passage to England, not for business, but permanent relocation. The plans had been abandoned abruptly on November 12th.
With no explanation, Sheriff Porter coordinated from the Magnolia Society, which remained sealed as a crime scene. By dawn on November 18th, he'd compiled his findings. 6 men had vanished from a locked room. No rational explanation existed for their disappearance. Evidence from their homes suggested collective involvement in something that had occurred in April 1847, something that had been weighing on them for months. The dates kept appearing. April. Something significant had happened that month, something criminal, something they'd tried to bury. On November 20th, Porter received an unexpected visitor. Albert Morrison, harbor master for Savannah's port, had heard about the disappearances and believed he had relevant information. Those 6 men, Morrison said, sitting across from Porter, they were making inquiries at the docks about a month ago, all of them separately, asking about the same thing. What thing? Porter asked. A ship called the Prosperity, arrived here April 5, 1847, departed April 9th. And they were asking about its cargo manifest, what it carried, where it came from. Porter leaned forward. What was the cargo? Morrison shifted uncomfortably. Officially, rice and indigo bound for Liverpool. But there were rumors, dockworkers' talk. They said the Prosperity came from West Africa, made an undocumented stop in the Caribbean, then arrived here. They said it rode too low in the water for the cargo it claimed to carry. You're suggesting illegal slave trading, Porter said carefully. I'm saying rumors existed. The international trade has been outlawed for decades, but it still happens. Southern ports, lax enforcement, officials who look the other way. Why would 6 wealthy merchants care about this ship? Because word among dock workers was that the Prosperity's voyage was financed by Savannah investors. The ship was supposed to bring them cargo they couldn't acquire legally anymore. But something went catastrophically wrong. What went wrong? Morrison asked. The ship arrived nearly empty. Whatever cargo it was supposed to have wasn't there. The investors lost a fortune. But more than that, the ship left Savannah that same night and never returned. Porter felt understanding settle like cold stone in his chest. He began pulling port records immediately. The Prosperity had indeed docked in Savannah in early April. Its manifest listed rice and indigo. The ship was registered out of Norfolk, owned by a trading company that, upon investigation, turned out to be a shell with no traceable ownership. Porter sent deputies to locate the 7 surviving crew members. 4 were found working odd jobs around Savannah's waterfront. All refused to discuss the Prosperity or its voyage. When questioned, one became violent, had to be physically restrained. Between shouts and curses, he managed one coherent statement. What's gone is gone. The water keeps what it takes. Leave it buried. 2 other crew members were slightly more cooperative, but only barely. Yes, they'd sailed on the Prosperity. Yes, the voyage had ended badly. No, they wouldn't provide details. When pressed about the missing crew members, both men became visibly frightened. One made the sign of the cross repeatedly. The other simply walked away, and no legal intimidation would bring him back. The remaining 3 crew members had vanished completely, left Savannah immediately after the Prosperity's departure, never been seen since. Porter obtained the ship's official log from port records. It was useless, bare minimum entries, nothing substantive. The captain was listed as Jacob Winters, a name that appeared in no other shipping records before or after the Prosperity's visit. The man had vanished as completely as the 6 merchants. But Porter had dates now. The Prosperity arrived April 5th. Evidence from the missing men's homes suggested something significant happened around April 7th to April 21st. That was when everything changed for them. That was when their fear began. On November 23rd, a man approached Porter's office. His name was Charles Griffin, a clerk at the Savannah Custom House, responsible for processing import documentation. Griffin was nervous, sweating despite the cool weather. There was paperwork, Griffin said quietly, about the Prosperity, paperwork that bypassed normal channels. Explain, Porter demanded. On April 8th, Robert Blackwell came to see me. Not to the main desk. He asked to speak privately. He knew I handled certain sensitive documents. He paid me $300 to expedite clearance for the Prosperity, to overlook inspection requirements, to ensure the ship could leave port without delays.
Did Blackwell explain why? No, but he was terrified. I could see it. He kept checking over his shoulder. He said the ship needed to leave as soon as possible, that every hour it remained in port was dangerous. He gave me a sealed envelope and told me if anything happened to me, I should bring it to authorities. Griffin reached into his coat and produced a yellowed envelope with Blackwell's wax seal. Porter broke it open and read, "If you are reading this, something has happened to me. This serves as both confession and evidence. In January 1847, 6 of us, myself, Edmund Whitmore, Daniel Prescott, Henry Caldwell, Samuel Dutton, and Jonathan Merrick, entered an agreement to finance a voyage. We sought to acquire cargo through means that had become illegal anymore, believing we could circumvent the law through careful planning and discretion. We hired the Prosperity and a captain willing to undertake the voyage to West Africa. The ship departed December 1846 with 18 crew. It was to return by March with cargo we would distribute among ourselves. The ship returned April 5, 1847. Everything had gone catastrophically wrong. The cargo was gone, all of it, 183 souls lost in circumstances the captain refused to fully explain. The crew that remained was half what departed. Those who remained were broken, haunted, barely coherent. The captain told us there had been a storm, that the cargo hold had flooded, that they'd done everything possible, but his eyes told a different story, one of terror and guilt that no amount of money could erase. We paid him anyway. We needed his silence about our involvement. The ship left that night. We thought we were done with it. We thought we could absorb the financial loss and be grateful we'd avoided legal consequences. But we were wrong. Strange things began happening. We received anonymous messages describing details of the voyage no one outside the crew could know. Notes left at our homes, symbols carved in trees on our properties, whispers from people we couldn't identify. More disturbing, we have all seen them. Figures at night, standing at the edges of our properties. When we approach, they vanish, but we see them clearly enough to know who they are or who they were. The faces of those we tried to buy, the faces of people who died because of our greed. I do not ask for forgiveness. I ask only that the truth be known. If something happens to me, investigate the Prosperity. Investigate April 1847. What we did demands accounting. The letter was signed and dated November 13th, 4 days before Blackwell vanished. Porter sat in the growing darkness of his office, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. He was beginning to understand the outline of what had happened. 6 men had financed an illegal slave trading voyage. The voyage had failed catastrophically, resulting in the deaths of 183 enslaved people and 11 crew members. The investors thought they could bury the truth by paying off survivors and letting the ship disappear. But someone had known. Someone had been sending them messages, haunting them, driving them towards some final confrontation. The words carved in the table, accounts come due. The tally marks, 183 distinct marks carved into rosewood.
As the investigation continued through late November, Porter's team interviewed hundreds of people. Patterns emerged that defied rational explanation. Enslaved people from the 6 men's properties reported their owners had become increasingly paranoid in the weeks before the disappearance. Extra guards were hired. Punishments became more severe, as if the owners were trying to maintain control through fear because they themselves were terrified. Multiple witnesses reported seeing strangers on the properties at night, people who didn't belong, walking the grounds after dark. When confronted, these strangers would disappear into darkness. Guards reported the same phenomenon, figures that seemed to dissolve when pursued. A woman named Sarah, enslaved on Whitmore's property, told an investigator about the night of November 16th. She'd been awakened by singing. Multiple voices coming from beyond the main house, singing in languages she didn't recognize. African languages, she thought, but not ones she knew. The singing lasted for hours, stopping just before dawn. When she mentioned it to the overseer, she was struck and told she'd imagined it. But other enslaved people on Whitmore's property confirmed hearing the same thing.
Similar reports came from the other 5 properties. Singing in the nights leading to November 17th, unexplained phenomena, a sense of building pressure like a storm about to break. The investigation uncovered another detail. On November 5th, all 6 men had received identical packages delivered anonymously. The packages contained sand, beach sand, mixed with fragments of rotted wood and small pieces of bone. Human bone, confirmed by a medical examiner. The message was clear. The sea had taken the cargo, but pieces remained. Someone had collected them and sent them back as a reminder, a promise, a warning. On December 2nd, news reached Porter that halted his investigation. A ship had run aground near Savannah's harbor. A fishing crew discovered it at dawn, wedged on a sandbar about a mile offshore. The ship's name was barely visible on its damaged hull, Prosperity. Porter assembled a team. They took boats to the sandbar where the Prosperity had grounded. The ship was in terrible condition. Hull cracked, masts broken, rigging tangled. It looked like it had been at sea for years, not months. The smell was overwhelming. Death and decay and seawater mixed into something that made strong men gag. They boarded carefully. The deck was treacherous, wood soft with rot. The main deck was chaos, cargo boxes broken, barrels smashed, everything covered in thick sediment. But no bodies, no crew, no cargo. They descended into the hold, the cargo hold where enslaved people would have been kept during the voyage, chained in conditions too horrific to fully document. The hold was dark, lit only by lanterns. What they found explained why the surviving crew had returned broken. The hold was filled with chains. Not just chains, shackles, all connected, all arranged in patterns used to restrain human cargo. 183 sets of chains, all locked, all empty. A ship's carpenter examined them carefully. These weren't picked, weren't broken, they're properly locked from the outside, but there's no one in them. How does someone escape locked shackles? How do 183 people escape simultaneously? On the hold's walls, messages carved in wood, hundreds of marks in multiple languages, names perhaps, prayers maybe, records of people who had been here, and one message in English carved deep into a support beam. They won't let us bury them. They searched the rest of the ship. In the captain's cabin, they found the ship's actual log, not the sanitized version filed with port authorities. The final entries were dated April 7th, 1847. Second day out of harbor. Storm hit last night. Worst in my 30 years at sea. Water came up so fast the cargo hold flooded before we could respond. By the time we got the hold open, they were gone. All 183. Not a single body. The chains were still locked. The hold was full of seawater, but no bodies. How is that possible? We've lost Henderson, Williams, McCarthy, Torres, Davis, Green, Sullivan, Patterson, Clark, Morgan, and Riley. Washed overboard in the storm. At least that's what I thought. But Davis was seen below deck this morning. Thompson swears he saw Davis standing in the flooded hold, waist deep in water. When Thompson called out, Davis didn't respond, just stood there, then sank into the water and was gone. I don't believe in supernatural vengeance, but something is wrong with this ship, something fundamental. The log ended there, no further entries. The Prosperity had somehow returned to Savannah, delivered its surviving crew, then disappeared back to sea. Now it had returned again, empty and rotting. Porter's team searched every inch. In a storage locker near the captain's cabin, wrapped in oilcloth and somehow preserved despite the ship's condition, they found 6 leather pouches. Each contained gold coins, substantial amounts. Each pouch had a name carved in the leather. Whitmore, Prescott, Blackwell, Caldwell, Dutton, Merrick. The money they'd paid to bury their crime had returned with the ship. Sheriff Porter filed his report with Savannah authorities, documenting everything discovered. The case of the 6 missing merchants was officially classified as unsolved, though Porter's report made clear his belief that their disappearance was directly connected to their financing of an illegal voyage that resulted in 183 deaths. The disappearance of 6 prominent merchants sent shockwaves through Savannah society. Families demanded answers, hired private investigators, threatened legal action. No additional evidence was ever found. Parlor 7 at the Magnolia Society was examined by experts from Boston and Philadelphia. Engineers, architects, even a stage magician who specialized in exposing fraudulent spiritualists. No one could explain how 6 men left a room locked from inside, leaving behind only their belongings and a smoking pipe. The table with its carved words and 183 tally marks was kept as evidence. The Magnolia Society eventually closed the room permanently. Members found it disturbing, reported feeling watched when they passed it in the hallway. The Prosperity was towed to Savannah's naval yard and secured. In January 1848, the ship sank at its moorings. No storm, no obvious damage. It simply settled into the water overnight and was gone by morning. Attempts to raise it failed. It remains there, buried in harbor mud, a grave marker for 183 people whose names were never recorded. Charles Griffin, the customs clerk, died in March 1848, found drowned in shallow water near the docks. The official verdict was accidental death, but circumstances were suspicious. Some believed he'd been silenced. Others thought guilt for his role had driven him to take his own life. The 4 surviving crew members found in Savannah left the city within months. None were located again. One crew member did resurface years later. In 1856, a dying sailor in Boston gave a deathbed confession to a priest. The sailor claimed he'd been on the Prosperity in April 1847. He described the storm, the flooded hold, the impossible disappearance of the chained cargo. But he added details never publicly reported. In the days after the storm, the surviving crew experienced shared nightmares. Every night they'd dream of drowning, of being chained in darkness while water rose around them. They'd wake gasping, choking, convinced they were actually drowning. Some nights they'd wake to find seawater in their bunks, despite being on a dry ship under clear skies. The sailor said the crew believed the cargo, those 183 people who died, weren't gone. They were with the ship, in the ship, part of the ship now, watching, waiting.
The families of the 6 missing men eventually moved forward with their lives. Widows remarried. Children grew up. Businesses were sold or passed to others. Time did what it always does, buried the past under layers of new present. But in Savannah, the story persisted. The Magnolia Society incident became local legend, the night 6 merchants vanished from a locked room. Students studied it as an unsolved mystery. Journalists periodically revisited the case, hoping to find new evidence. No one ever did. In conversations that happened quietly, in hidden places where such things could be spoken, enslaved people from the 6 men's properties told a different version of the story. They spoke of singing in the nights before the disappearance, of figures that walked the properties after dark, of a woman who stood at a property line on the morning of November 18th, tears streaming down her face, saying only, "They came back. They found what they were looking for." The truth about what happened in Parlor 7 on November 17, 1847 remained unknown. 6 men entered a locked room and never emerged. Their fate became Savannah's most enduring mystery. But perhaps the mystery itself is the answer. Perhaps the point isn't what happened to 6 guilty men, but what their disappearance represented. Evidence that some debts demand payment, that some crimes are too great to be buried or bought off, that justice exists in forms that can't be stopped by locked doors or social position or the protection of unjust laws. The Prosperity remains in Savannah's harbor, buried under silt and time. On foggy nights, sailors sometimes report seeing lights near where the ship went down, ghostly illuminations moving beneath the water's surface. Fishermen avoid the area, claiming their nets come up empty there or tangled with chains.
Parlor 7 was eventually demolished when the Magnolia Society building was renovated in 1879. The table, with its carved words and tally marks, was supposedly stored in a warehouse. In 1893, that warehouse burned. The table was lost, but the story remained. Still remains. The Savannah vanishing, the night 6 merchants disappeared. A mystery without solution, a disappearance without explanation. Unless you understand that some explanations exist beyond what can be proven in courts or written in official reports, unless you accept that 183 people who died in chains in a flooded hold might have found a way to hold their killers accountable, unless you believe that the ocean, having taken so much, might have given something back, not the dead themselves, but the justice they were denied. On clear nights in Savannah, you can stand at the waterfront and look out over the harbor, the same water that carried those suffering ships, the same water that took 183 souls whose names were never recorded, whose lives were considered cargo, whose deaths were treated as financial loss rather than human tragedy. The water is still there, still moving, still holding its secrets. And somewhere beneath its surface, the prosperity waits, a monument to the truth that some crimes stain deeper than time can wash away, that some reckonings come regardless of locked doors or the protection of privilege, that justice denied in life finds ways to manifest that no law can prevent and no power can stop. 6 men vanished on November 17, 1847. They were never found, and perhaps that, in itself, is exactly the ending their story deserved.